I want to start our conference, and the first panel, which I will moderate and also present on, is going to be focused on the U.S. context. And we are very fortunate to have three excellent scholars who I myself look up to, admire their scholarship, cite their scholarship frequently, and I consider myself someone who is really following the path that they have trailed, the path that they have created in my own scholarship. So it's always an honor to be with those people that you've been reading their work and citing them, and then finally you get to meet them and join them in the academic engagement process. So first we have Professor Mustafa Bayoumi. He is a professor of English at Brooklyn College, City University of New York, and a columnist for The Guardian. He is the author of How Does It Feel to Be a Problem, Being Young and Arab in America, which is a book that has impacted me and many, many other Arab Americans. So thank you, Professor Bayoumi, for writing that book that articulated what we had been feeling. And that is really the sign of an excellent book. The book won an American Book Award and the Arab American Book Award for Nonfiction. And his other book, This Muslim American Life, Dispatches from the War on Terror, was published by NYU Press, also won the Arab American Book Award for Nonfiction. In 2012, he co-edited with Lizzie Ratner a special issue of The Nation magazine on Islamophobia, and in 2016 received the Pathmaker to Peace Award from the organization Brooklyn for Peace. Next, we will have Professor Zayn Abdullah, who is an award-winning scholar and associate professor of religion and society and Islamic studies at Temple University. He is the author of Black Mecca, The African Muslims of Harlem, published by Oxford University Press, in addition to editing a Routledge volume on Islam and race and a special issue on visual culture and Black Muslim portraitures for the Muslim World Journal. Professor Abdullah is currently completing a book on the Nation of Islam in mid-20th century America. And again, Professor Abdullah's work is instrumental in the study of Muslims in the United States, and I have been very, very grateful and indebted for his work on these issues. Dr. Abdullah is the 2018 recipient of the prestigious Senior Ford Foundation Fellowship Award. His public awards include a New Jersey State Assembly resolution in recognition of distinguished service. Next, we have Professor Zarina Grewal, who is an associate professor of American Studies, Religious Studies, Anthropology, and Ethnicity, Race, and Migration at Yale University. Her documentary film, By the Dawn's Early Light, Chris Jackson's Journey to Islam, examines Islamophobia before September 11, 2001, through the story of the NBA player dubbed the Kaepernick of the 90s. She is author of a very well-known and highly recognized and highly impactful book called Islam as a Foreign Country, American Muslims and the Global Crisis of Authority, published by NYU Press. And her current book project, which we are all very eager for it to come out soon, inshallah, is called Is the Quran a Good Book?, which explores the meanings the Quran has for Americans in relation to national debates about religious tolerance, racism, and culture wars. So, as you can see, we are in brilliant company and very much looking forward to our discussion. And just to let the audience know that the order we will go in will be Professor Bayoumi, and then I will present, and then we will have Professor Zayn Abdullah and Professor Zarina Grewal, after which we will have a Q&A session wherein those in the audience can submit via chat or in written questions via the technology. So if you are listening, there is an opportunity for you to also engage and ask questions during the Q&A period. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Bayoumi. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It is, can everyone hear me okay? Yes? It's a strange thing to address an empty room a little bit. So I'm just looking straight into the abyss, sort of. But nevertheless, I am delighted to be here, and I would like to first of all offer my deep gratitude and thanks to Sahar Aziz, the indefatigable Sahar Aziz, who has really worked very hard on putting this conference together and is doing excellent, amazing work at her center as well. So my great thanks to you. And of course, also my thanks to Jude and Angela for bringing me here. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here this morning. So the organization of the conference in the organization of the conference, there was a request for a title that came before the panels were organized, okay? So I had put a title that didn't make sense necessarily for the panels as they are now organized. So don't pay attention to the title that's in the program, in other words, because I'm not going to talk about that. I thought instead that I would talk a little bit more conceptually about the conference itself and maybe bring some questions around Islamophobia in the United States within that fold. And the reason why I'm saying that is obviously Islamophobia is a tremendously important topic these days. It causes all kinds of conflicts and blood is shed because of Islamophobia globally. There's no question. And not only that, we live in an age now, as we all know, with Donald Trump, who incidentally just discovered that Europe is a Muslim country, because he won't let Europeans now come to the... Yeah, okay. I stole that from Facebook, by the way, this morning. But it's not just limited to Donald Trump and his practices, Islamophobia, as it were. This is something that has both a populist and a state-centered orientation. And so I think it's important to also recognize the relationships between state and the people when it comes to Islamophobia. But I want to also offer a bit of a warning about about this conference too, or just about Islamophobia discussions in general. Because I think that there can be a tendency, when we talk about Islamophobia, especially globally, to see Islamophobia everywhere. And I think that Islamophobia is different in different places. And those differences are hugely important. And the notion of flattening out Islamophobia to the point where we just see the phenomenon of it everywhere could run the danger of just seeing Muslims as victims around the world. And in fact, the corollary of that is that it reinscribes, in effect, the same clash of civilizations theory, albeit from the point of view of the victim, which is something that I would reject. So I think it's important that we conceptualize Islamophobia very rigorously instead. So we can even begin with the term or the phenomenon. Where does Islamophobia begin? Does it begin, as Sahar Aziz was suggesting in her opening remarks, with the terrorist attacks of 2001? Or does it begin in 1997 with the Runnymede Trust's definition of Islamophobia? That's in the UK. That's where you first start to get the term Islamophobia being widely discussed. Or is it something to do with, say, post-war labor migrations into Europe from the late 1940s into the 1960s and beyond? Is it 1923 with the end of the Ottoman Empire? Is it 1492 with the fall of Muslim Spain? Is it all the same or is it different? What about Islamophobia within Western countries or within Muslim majority countries? Some people who are within Muslim majority countries that are run by secular states who would subscribe to Islamic parties or Islamic ideologies would also say that there's Islamophobia within their own states. Is that the same thing as Islamophobia within a Western state? Or even countries that have long histories of Muslim minorities, such as Greece. I don't think it's the same. I think they're all different, and I think the differences count. And I think what we should be paying attention to, in fact, is those differences. I think it's important to specify when and which Islamophobia we're talking about in order to know what we are talking about. And also because we should analyze the discourse as a way to see when things change and how they change. Let me give you a little personal history as well for this. I was born in Europe. I was born in Switzerland. I've spent significant chunks of my life in Europe and in Canada and in the United States. And I think I've lived through some of these changes themselves, probably most pronounced in Europe, and especially in France, Germany, and the Netherlands. One used to talk about, say, the Arabs of France very commonly. One talked about the Turks in Germany or the Moroccans in the Netherlands. But now the broad and overarching use of the term the Muslims of France, Germany, or the Netherlands, or even the United States is a relatively new phenomenon. There's been a shift, in other words, from an ethnic to a religious identity within these years. When we are talking about Islamophobia today, I think we are often discussing an Islamophobia that is quite specific and whose manifestations begin to appear somewhere in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s. So the question is, what historically allows for that appearance? And I'm speaking specifically of, say, as Muslim minority populations in North America and in Europe. And I think it's not about a long-standing or inevitable clash between Islam and the West at all. Today's Islamophobia, on the contrary, I would suggest, is a symptom in the malaise of our global modernity. What I mean more specifically is that I think we should think about two historical forces that have been moving along their respective, though not completely unrelated, tracks of history, and who meet at the intersection of today's Islamophobia. And these two forces that I'm discussing are globalization and late-stage imperialism. Globalization produces two different effects that I think we should take note of. The first is a homogenizing effect. When all the stores around the world are the same, you know, you can go to, if you go to any of the major European capitals, you see exactly the same stores now on the same streets, right? When the food is becoming more and more the same, the movies are often the same, the airports are the same, the architecture is the same, the hotel rooms are the same. I mean, I travel a fair bit. I'm sure people in this audience travel even more than I do. Sometimes you wake up in a hotel room and you're not even sure where you are anymore because the hotel rooms all look the same, right? This is hardly a new worry, this homogenizing effect. In his masterpiece and melancholic ethnography, Tristropique, Claude Lévi-Strauss laments the fact that the world of different and unique cultures was fast disappearing before his very eyes. And he was writing that in the mid-1950s. The homogeneity produced by globalization is a lamentable fact for the species, according to him, and it's death for the cultural anthropologist. In fact, this is a sentence from Tristropique, which I think is an evocative one, where he says, "The first thing we see as we travel around the world is our own filth thrown into the face of mankind." Now, much has been said about the cultural differences of Muslims in the West specifically, or global migrants in the West generally. But not nearly enough is said about the cultural anxiety of disappearance found in the West because of the homogenizing effects of globalization. And that, in fact, is a motor of the populism, which is in the other half of the title of this symposium. There is, I would say, a fear, a populist fear, but not only populist, in many Western countries, and not only Western countries, that they are losing their cultures. The tension that of course I don't endorse that, I'm just describing it. The tension that Muslim minorities are taking over their cultures, that Muslim minorities are taking over the cultures of their host societies, may really be about this fact. Muslim minorities function as stand-ins for a displaced malaise. To those in the host culture, Muslim minority differences accentuate a feeling of the host society's disappearance that was already there and is growing. And globalization further has exacerbated massive amounts of global economic insecurity and has grown global inequality. This adds to the neuroses. this economic insecurity can and does easily morph into questions then around national security. You can't separate questions around migrants from questions around class and economics. And discursively, Muslims are seen as migrants today, despite the fact that Muslim communities have long, durable histories in these Muslim minority countries. And I'm sure Zayn will probably describe some of that too. Nevertheless, Muslims discursively are seen as migrants today precisely because of the discourse reinvented them as Muslims around the late 1990s and early 2000s. You know, in other words, another way of saying that is, actually, I think that there were no Muslim, if we're talking about the US context, Muslim Americans only have existed in the United States since around 2001. There were no Muslim Americans before 2001. You had Americans who were Muslims, for sure, for a very long time. But you only had Muslim Americans as a discourse, and therefore as a community in relationship to that discourse in the wake of 2001. The other phenomenon is late-stage imperialism that I'm suggesting here. The common assumption is that the 9/11 attacks largely account for the growth of Islamophobia today. But let's just play a counterfactual game for 1 second. What if, after 9/11, Osama bin Laden had been captured or turned over, tried, and then punished, and then that meant that there had been no war in Afghanistan and no war in Iraq, etc.? What if that had happened? Of course, we'll never know. But it's probably fair to say that today's climate is much more really about the kind of response that happened after 9/11, Iraq especially, than the attacks of 9/11. And that it's the response then that feeds today's violence. The history we should be paying attention to is not the history, I think, of the Crusades or of Al-Andalus, but instead the history of European colonialism and the imperial drive for territory and resources. And history shows us that colonial violence produces violence, sometimes violence of the most evil, nihilistic, horrific, and immoral sort. But that blowback is bound to happen. So separate from the global labor migrations of the 1960s forward is something else. The rise of new levels of violence related to the conquest and control of territory in the Middle East and South Asia that occurred especially after 9/11. Just because the blowback violence occasioned by this violence articulates its rationale and justification in the name of Islam doesn't mean we have to accept it as such, obviously. We don't have to interpret this violence as Muslim battles per se. That would be falling into ahistorical or ideological traps. And of course, sometimes this blowback violence hits the metropolitan center, again, in the most horrific ways. And because it's articulated and understood as violence occasioned by Islam, and not as imperialism's blowback political violence, the vulnerable Muslim communities, who overwhelmingly live their lives on other terms and do not structure their lives around imperial violence, take the brunt of the blame for this violence. So what I'm suggesting is we have these two tracks meeting in the late 1990s or early 2000s, globalization and late-stage imperialism. The two tracks unite in a mash of anxiety, fear, insecurity, and racism. Muslims are created discursively as a category. The state seeks to patrol and control them. And we have the birth, then, of contemporary Islamophobia. And Muslims globally identify more as Muslims, too, as another function of globalization. Previously, their identification was more likely prominent, but perhaps not dominant. I fear that we are so caught up, that we can get so caught up in our pain that, and since we are subject to violence of the state and of the racists, or so caught up in defending ourselves from the state and the racists, that perhaps we would fail to see the near history and even novelty of our condition. This is important because we don't have to be defensive. We have to be analytical and organized to grasp our condition and change it for the better. So in the US, the way that this has manifested itself, I think, is quite clear. In the US, what we're looking at is largely a state-centered phenomenon. Islamophobia, I would say, has been, in the post-2001 era, has largely been state-centered. And the reason why it hasn't necessarily caught on the populist level to an enormous degree is because there was no need for it, because the state was taking over a lot of that control. We have all kinds of things from the USA Patriot Act at the beginning. We have sweep arrests that occurred right after 9/11. We have special registration, which led to the massive registration of Muslim males across the country. We have an emboldened FBI. We have use of spies and informants within the Muslim communities. We have, of course, NYPD spying, which occurred all the way up to Rutgers campus as well. We have all of these things up until, and we haven't even finished yet with Donald Trump's Muslim bans. Of course, we had the most recent iteration of that ban just happened a couple of weeks ago, or several weeks ago. Now up to, I think it's, 13 countries or so? And of course, the other fact of that is that not a single person from any of those 13 countries has been responsible for killing anybody for a terrorist-related act in the United States since 2001. So it's very state-centered. It's very organized, and of course, it is effective. It is effective on a political level, because what we also know in the United States context is that Islamophobia, according to the polling data, does peak in certain moments in the United States. But those moments tend not to be those times when we have a horrific terrorist attack, either here or abroad. The moments when those peaks occur are actually regular and predictable, and they tend to be every 4 years. Every 4 years when there's an election cycle, right? So what we're seeing in the United States is not just an expression of hatred, but we're seeing an instrumentalization of hatred and instrumentalization of Islamophobia into our public discourse, right? Into our political discourse. It's being instrumentalized in all kinds of ways. What I think is actually quite fascinating in this year that we are now living through, an election year again, is the ways in which actually that's may perhaps changed a little bit right now. For example, you may recall in 2008, when there was the election for Barack Obama versus John McCain, there was a moment when the Obama campaign was giving a public rally in Detroit, Michigan. There were two women in hijab who would have been behind Obama at that time. And the Obama campaign moved them out of camera's view because they didn't want the association of Islam with Barack Obama, who at that time was being so-called smeared for being a secret Muslim. Right. What's interesting about our electioneering moment right now is that, in fact, you have this massive inclusion campaign from the Democratic side of women in hijab in all kinds of campaign commercials, to the point where the women who are in the hijabs in the commercials are discovering that they're being used, their image is being used not for the candidate that they support, right? So in fact, you've seen it in Joe Biden's campaign. The woman said that, in fact, she was a Bernie Sanders supporter and these sorts of things, right? So we're seeing a shifting degree of Muslim discourse within our political dialogue right now at this very moment. And I think that also is very interesting, and we should be paying attention to that at the same time. I'm sure we'll have a lot more to say about the U.S. context in particular, and I'm happy to have a conversation with my colleagues here about it as well. But I did want to start off with a sort of warning about thinking about the warning of flattening out Islamophobia globally. You know, between globalization and imperialism, our modernity has created a crisis in the nation state. This is one very good reason why our focus has to be not solely on our conditions as Muslims or as scholars of Islam or Islamophobia, but on the general condition of the nations in which we live, and perhaps also even those from which we hail. We will never be able to change the conditions of the state on our own, but we have every reason to forge a common destiny with others who are also forced to live narrowly in a globalized and colonized world, and those who see that the liberal state is not living up to all of its promises. We will never be able to solve the problems of Islamophobia by seeking only to solve the problems of Islamophobia. Because the problem of Islamophobia is much larger than our communities. It's about racial and economic oppression as much as it is about gender oppression, sexual oppression, and much more. That is why we, as researchers, perhaps even as members of Muslim communities, must fight for the freedom of faith, but all faiths, and must fight for the freedom of expression, even sometimes hateful expressions. And we must also fight for the freedom to assemble and protest for everyone and everywhere, whether that be in the United States, in France, in Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, regardless. And I will just end on that note because I think the most important thing is to realize that the fight to end Islamophobia is not the fight for inclusion for Muslims. It's the fight for the emancipation of everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bayoumi. So I'd now like to address the issue of what I call as a lawyer, one of the benefits of this conference is it truly is an interdisciplinary conference where we all come from different disciplines. And so the disclaimer, perhaps just a description, is that I'm a lawyer. And so the perspective that I bring is very much rights-focused and rights-based. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about the intersection of race and religion and how that affects Muslims' civil rights and civil liberties, particularly in the national security context. So America is a bastion of religious freedom, a land where persecuted religious minorities find refuge from the tyranny of the majority. So goes the narrative that is taught in schools throughout the nation and that permeates American culture. And yet, Muslims in America have found religious freedom in practice to be more myth than reality. Law enforcement agencies surveil mosques, Islamic schools, and Muslim-owned businesses. The government scrutinizes Muslims' personal associations, their travel, their religious practices. And following the government's lead, private citizens then distrust their Muslim neighbors, their co-workers, and their customers. As a result, Muslims have experienced unprecedented levels of discrimination at work and schools. Their mosques have been vandalized, and they have been victims of hate crimes. Now, that Muslims are experiencing such overt discrimination at a time when contestation over religious liberty is a national issue brings into sharp relief that religious freedom is not equally available to all faiths. Conservative evangelical Christians decry the secular assault by liberal elites with regard to contraception, abortion, same-sex marriage, and religion in schools. And yet, many of these same Muslims simultaneously support state practices that quash Muslims' religious freedoms. So this begs the question, why, for a critical mass of Americans, are Muslims' rights to be safe in their mosques, wear their religious garb without fear of discrimination, and live as first-class citizens not protected by religious freedom? And why do the same people that defend religious freedom for Christians simultaneously support violating the civil rights of Muslims? The explanation, as I argue in my forthcoming book, The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, is that Muslims are treated like a suspect race, not a religious minority. In turn, Islam is placed in the realm of politics, and more specifically national security, not the realm of religion. And thus, state practices and private discrimination, contrary to American religious freedom norms, are considered rational and patriotic. Thus, Muslims are not a religious minority eligible for religious freedom protections, nor do they belong to American national identity, regardless of their U.S. citizenship. Rather, Muslims are a suspect race, permanent foreigners and national security threats who warrant exclusion, purging, or incarceration to protect real, in quotes, white Judeo-Christian, end quotes, Americans. So racialization in turn produces tangible adverse legal consequences. It results in the presumption specifically that Muslims are more prone to terrorism, which in turn informs U.S. national security policies and practices. Now, harms range from mass surveillance and selective anti-terrorism prosecutions to to employment discrimination to hate crimes and denial of new mosque constructions, all of which caused some Muslims to hide their religious identity and circumscribe how they practice their faith in public. Similar stereotypes that historically racialized Jews, Catholics, and Mormons apply today against what I call the racial Muslim, such as heathen, barbaric, illiberal, despotic, and most importantly, unfit for self-governance. The material consequences, however, differ depending on the historical context and the certain stereotypes associated with a particular faith community. So in the case of Muslims in the contemporary era, racialization securitizes their individual and communal lives, causing the U.S. government to interact with Muslim communities exclusively through a security lens. That is, Muslim communities matter only for purposes of securing the nation, not to protect their civil liberties and rights as equal citizens. The security state thus has unleashed its heavy hand upon Muslim communities nationwide in the United States. As the FBI's counterterrorism budget tripled from $3.81 billion in 2001 to over $10 billion in 2017, more than a third of its funding went toward counterterrorism operations, including thousands of paid informants and undercover agents infiltrating Muslim communities looking for terrorist plots. And if none could be found, then the informants manufactured the plots. So law enforcement scrutinized mosques, Muslim-owned businesses, and Muslim student groups, including at Rutgers University, in search of terrorists. In the most aggressive mass surveillance program since 9/11, the New York Police Department established a web of informants who compiled dossiers on thousands of Muslims, designated mosques as potential terrorist organizations, recorded religious sermons, and surveilled congregations without any reasonable suspicion of illegal activity. A new demographics unit tasked with mapping Muslims in the tri-state area entailed plainclothes police officers eavesdropping on political conversations in cafes where Muslims congregate. Undercover agents were predisposed to presume guilt, in part due to the Islamophobic training in police departments. So NYPD officers received training by government-paid instructors who promoted the clash of civilizations narrative. Trainers warned police officers, quote, "Islam is a highly violent, radical religion that mandates that all of the earth must be Muslim," end quote. Taking from the COINTEL playbook that subverted African-American civil rights groups in the 1960s, including African-American Muslims, the NYPD sent paid informants, infiltrators into mosques, student associations, and communities where they took pictures, they recorded license plate numbers, and they kept notes of political conversations. One of the informants stated in a court affidavit, quote, "My NYPD boss, Steve, told me that the NYPD did not think the John Jay Muslim Student Association was doing anything wrong. They just wanted to make sure," end quote. The informant admitted, quote, "The members of the Muslim Student Association were religious Muslims, and according to my NYPD boss, Steve, the NYPD considers being a religious Muslim a terrorism indicator," end quote. So as a result, religious Muslims were preyed upon through FBI sting operations across the country. The widespread use of informants, estimated at 15,000 domestically as of 2008, which is the last we know of public records, we think it's larger now by 2020, is reportedly 10 times the number of informants active during the era of J. Edgar Hoover during COINTELPRO. And these informants pose serious risks to Muslim civil liberties. In 2007, for example, informant Muhammad Omar lured 3 undocumented immigrant Muslims from the former immigrant brothers from the former Yugoslavia into a conspiracy he manufactured in Fort Dix, New Jersey. Then Attorney General Chris Christie, eager for a high-profile anti-terrorism case to launch his political career, argued the case on weak circumstantial evidence based on the defendants simply opposing the U.S. war on terror, the U.S. war in Iraq, becoming more religious, going to a shooting range during a vacation in Pennsylvania, in a country that protects the Second Amendment right to own guns, and watching videos by Al-Qaeda. And despite this particular informant's best efforts, he could not obtain even a verbal commitment by these brothers to engage in a violent act. Ultimately, all he could do was convince the brothers to illegally purchase guns, which triggered multiple indictments, including anti-terrorism charges. And so the informant walked away with $238,000, and the Muslim Brothers are spending the rest of their lives in a maximum security prison. Indeed, informant-led plots continued when in 2009 in Newburgh, New York, FBI informant Shahid Hussein lured 4 Muslim men, all of whom were African-American converts, into a fake terror attack on Jewish targets in the Bronx. The informant offered these men $250,000, a free holiday, and expensive cars for help with the attack. The informant meticulously organized transporting the missile and bombs to the reconnaissance missions. But the defendants, the targets of the sting operation, were so ill-equipped to carry out the plot that they did not even own driver's licenses or cars. Unsurprisingly, news of the massive surveillance and sting operations had a chilling effect across Muslim communities nationwide. Some Muslims feared that attending mosques and associating with other Muslims could ensnare them in a government sting operation. Indeed, one of the plaintiffs who sued the NYPD challenging its mass surveillance program admitted, quote, he has decreased his mosque attendance significantly since learning that the mosques he attends have been under surveillance by the NYPD, end quote. Other Muslims also concluded that the risk of subjecting oneself to being featured in a police file is reason enough to cease attending the mosque or praying with other Muslims. Some Muslims also altered their physical appearance by remaining clean-shaven or not wearing a headscarf. Many Muslims were generally fearful of being outspoken on political issues affecting Muslims in America, all of which deeply implicate our First Amendment speech and association rights, including our religious freedom rights. Now, one of the intended objectives of this racialization process of Muslims is making the stakes of practicing Islam very high in terms of liberty interests and dignitary interests. The FBI's counterterrorism mandate, thus, is informed by specious theories of radicalization associating Islamic practices with terrorist tendencies. So, praying frequently at mosques, growing a beard, wearing a hijab, refraining from drinking alcohol, and criticism of U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and other Muslim-majority countries triggers FBI suspicion of terrorist plans. An aggressive preventative counterterrorism model focuses law enforcement's attention on Muslims with ideologies the government deems radical. The same reasoning that criminalized Black Muslim civil rights activists decades earlier. Thus, only through secularization and assimilation into white Protestant norms can a Muslim evade the heavy hand of the security state. Now, some degree of public approval is required for the government to engage in these racial projects against a religious minority without being perceived as eroding American religious freedom rights. Due in large part to a well-financed Islamophobia industry and negative media portrayals of Muslims, public opinion of Muslims has remained low for nearly 2 decades. In general, it ranges from 40 to 50% of Americans have very low opinions of Muslims in terms of suspecting them of not being loyal citizens, not wanting them as neighbors, not believing they should ever be president or hold any high-level office position. And there's a disproportionate number of those 40 to 50% that are Republican or self-identify as political conservatives and evangelical Christians. Now, it will continue so this Islamophobia mass surveillance program and national security paradigm will continue so long as a critical mass of Americans view Islam as a violent political ideology and Muslims as a collective security threat. Indeed, double standards lie at the heart of racialization. Members of dominant racial religious groups are treated and judged by their individual actions, whereas members of the minority groups are presumed guilty based on the criminal acts of a few individuals, like 19 hijackers out of 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, who share their religious identities or national origin. As a result, Christian conservatives who suspect Muslims do not believe they are betraying religious freedom principles when they support Muslim travel bans, oppose mosque constructions, or approve singling out Muslims in countering terrorism. Rather, these Christian conservatives, self-identifying, they reconcile the contradiction by redefining Islam, by placing it outside the purview of religion. To them, Islam is not religion. It is political ideology. To them, Islam is not holy. It is man-made by savages, and to them, Muslims are a suspect race. So in closing, the lessons taught in American school of liberty and justice for all are more myth than reality for tens of millions of racial minorities in the United States, including Muslims. Despite advances in civil rights law, race continues to function as a master category that determines how resources, dignity, and rights are distributed. For the past 2 decades, immigrant Muslims have faced the full brunt of that reality as their religious identities have been transformed into a suspect racial identity. Their experiences evince what African Americans already know. Religious freedom is not, nor has it ever been, equally available to all faith communities in the United States. And only when we accept this reality can we as a nation move forward in transforming our aspirations for religious freedom and racial equality into practice. For it is the willingness to examine and eradicate racialized double standards that makes meaningful religious freedom for all a possibility in America. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here, and I want to begin by thanking Sahar Aziz and Barbara Lee for the invitation and for your tenacity, your courage, and foresight to organize such a gathering around this crucial topic. To Angela Mullis and Judd McLean, thank you for all that you do for making this operate and run smoothly. I know that oftentimes we don't acknowledge enough people who are behind the scenes and making this whole thing happen. But you definitely, I want to make sure that you are, that you feel like you are appreciated. And to our distinguished colleagues and guests, thank you for your presence. And for those tuning in remotely, I want to also welcome you. So for my presentation that sort of looks at the name means everything, Islam, blackness, and the dilemma of race in America, I take a different approach. I was trained as an anthropologist, so I'm interested oftentimes in the vernacular. I'm interested in what happens on the ground between people, or how the larger state apparatus impacts what happens on the ground, how people respond to that as well. So for me, it's a different scenario, and as most people will focus on the phobia of Islamophobia, I focus on the Islam of Islamophobia. So I want to understand, what is this thing called Islam? What kind of Islam are we talking about? And what do we mean when we invoke it? So the first part of my talk, as you can see, begins with the name means everything, which is derived from a statement by Noble Drew Ali, who was a founder of the Moorish Science Temple of the 1920s, who argued that knowing the meaning of words is a powerful force against ignorance and oppression. And this is the topic of one of my book projects that was sponsored by the Ford Foundation. And it's to try to understand what do we mean by the idea of Islam itself, and how has this shifted over the past 100 years? And for whom? How does it work? Why does it work? And who does it obscure? Who does it foreground? So again, for me, it's about how do race and religion work in America? This is what I'm trying to understand. For this talk, I divide it into 3 parts. One is sort of where did we begin, or how did we begin this kind of conversation? Where have we been, and where are we now? Right? So do I just click? Okay. Oh, good. All right. So I begin here with the Bhagat Singh Thin image here. You see him here, and those of you who can see, sorry for those who cannot. I apologize for that. But the Naturalization Act of 1790 in the U.S. restricted citizenship to free white persons, but failed to define who exactly is white. For many people of Asian descent and others began petitioning the court, claiming that they were white by law. To begin, Bhagat Singh Singh, an Indian immigrant, lost his U.S. Supreme Court petition in 1923 for all Indians to be classified as white. While the court declared that he possessed the, quote, purity of Aryan blood, he could not be Caucasian in the common understanding of white persons. Then was a follower of the Sikh religion, and this was a major issue for a country informed both by a white Anglo-Saxon culture and Protestant religion. It kind of skipped ahead. How do I get back? Oh, okay. All right, it's not, okay, good. For others, the court used religion or Christianity to define race, the race of the applicant. In 1910, Tom Ellis, a Syrian, petitioned the court for citizenship, and it was granted, but not before his Christianity was made clear. Quote, the applicant is a Syrian, a native of the province of Palestine, and a Maronite. It may be said further that he was reared a Catholic and is still of that faith. During the World War II, Ahmed Hassan, a Yemeni Muslim, applied for citizenship and was denied. On December 14th, 1942, Judge Arthur Tuttle declared, quote, Arabs are not white persons within the meaning of the Nationality Act, unquote. Using Hassan's religion to determine his race, Judge Tuttle added, apart from the dark skin of the Arabs, it is well known that they are a part of the Mohammedan world, and that a wide gulf separates their culture from that of their predominantly Christian peoples of Europe. Finally, he stated, it could not be expected that as a class, they would readily intermarry with our population and be assimilated into our civilization. However, Hassan was well prepared to demonstrate his whiteness. With countless affidavits from ethnologists literally stuffed under his arm, they affirmed that, quote, the Arabs are remote descendants of and therefore members of the Caucasian or white race, and that Hassan is therefore eligible for citizenship. Still, his petition was denied. Okay. Just 17 months later, an Arab from Arabia, Maurice, applied for citizenship in 1944. Unlike Hassan, his petition was granted precisely because he was from the Muslim world, which now made him white. The court decision stated that, quote, the Arab passes muster as a white person. So Judge Charles Wazansky ends by stating the need to, quote, to promote friendlier relations between the United States and other nations, so as to fulfill the promise that we shall treat all men as created equal. So these court decisions clearly reveal the slippery slope of how race and religion become strange bedfellows. And this complicates our discussion of Islam and how Islam and race fit together or interact with one another. In 1932, the Baltimore, it did not advance on the screen for some reason. Okay. It's a different, okay, I can see. All right, so it's different from what I'm seeing here. All right. In 1932, the Baltimore Afro-American had a contest to decide which name was best for Black people. The paper received 6,000 replies. This is in 1932, 6,000 replies. Most felt the label Negro indicated a non-mixed race and could foster racial pride and solidarity. Others felt colored spoke to the variety of experiences among people of African descent, while others used the terms American, Afro-American, Black, Ethio-African, polynational, and even omninational. One of the Moorish Science Temple members, which was an Islamic group with 1913 roots in Newark, New Jersey, declared, "Take off that slavery name Negro and give us our God-given Moorish American, and let us be men among men." Another Moorish American member, Alec Brown Bay, refused to acknowledge the Negro designation on his draft form in 1942, declaring that being a Moorish American was a divinely given name for him and for all Negroes, and to refuse it was a violation of God's command. Okay. Dawood Ahmed Faisal, as you can see here in the middle, with the gutra, with the long scarf on, and also you see him to the right standing with Malcolm X. They're at the United Nations in 1963 in this photo. Was an Grenadian Muslim who registered the Islamic Mission of America in Brooklyn in 1944. But he traveled extensively promoting his message in his book, Al-Islam, The Religion of Humanity. Faisal urged African Americans to reject their status as Negroes by returning to their original religion and their sacred language of Arabic. He said, "You are Muslims, not Negroes. There are no such people or nationality called Negro. Your nationality is the country of your birth. Return and worship the one true God in Islam. It will free you from the companionship of the devil, from sin and enslavement." Okay. For Paul Nathaniel Johnson, known as Sheikh Ahmed Din, and these four women here of the Ahmadiyya movement, Islam could solve the race problem by returning all people of African descent, or Negroes, to their rightful place as equals among other races, as members of a multiracial or universal family. And in a letter written in 1923, Dean stated, quote, "My dear American Negro, assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you and the mercy of Allah. The Christian profiteers brought you out of your native lands of Africa, and in Christianizing you, made you forget the religion and language of your forefather, which were Islam and Arabic. Join Islam, the real faith of universal brotherhood, which all at once does away with all distinctions of race, color, and creed." So you can see at the beginning, Islam was used as a state apparatus to determine one's citizenship. Here, you begin to see African Americans deploying the notion of Islam as a corrective to a racist society that's actually trying to use it to subjugate African Americans into a second-class citizenship. Now, you see this? Okay, good. In the jazz world, Dizzy Gillespie, the legendary trumpeter, bandleader, and composer, was unsure about the Islamic conversion of his fellow musicians in the 1940s and 50s, but he paid close attention to how everyday racism seemed to change for those in his band who claimed to be Muslim. Dizzy begins, "Man, if you join that Muslim faith, you ain't colored no more. You'll be white," they say. "You get a new name and you don't have to be a nigger no more." They had no black consciousness, he said. All they were trying to do was escape the stigma of being colored. All right. When these cats found out that Idris Suleiman, who joined the Muslim faith about that time, could go into these white restaurants and bring out sandwiches to the other guys because he wasn't colored, and he looked like the inside of a chimney. He was very dark. They started enrolling in droves. Musicians started having it printed on their union cards where it said race, W, white. Kenny Clark has one, and he showed it to me. He said, "See, nigga, I ain't no spook. I'm white, W." Another cat went into this restaurant, and they said that they didn't serve colors in there. He said, "I don't blame you. But I don't have to go under the rule of colored because my name is Mustafa Dalil." All right. In the early 1960s, Dr. C. Eric Lincoln and Malcolm X shared friendship and Lincoln's book, The Black Muslims in America, helped to establish the Nation of Islam as a legitimate religion in the mainstream. Still, Malcolm X and the Muslims in the Nation of Islam objected to the term Black Muslim, which the media quickly embraced as a common reference to the group. Malcolm explained, the name Black Muslims distressed everyone in the Nation of Islam. I tried for at least 2 years to kill off that Black Muslim. No, Malcolm blared, we are Black people in America. Our religion is Islam. We are properly called Muslims, but that Black Muslim name never got dislodged. In the early to mid 20th century, making the distinction between race and religion or using Islam as a corrective to oppressive racial labels reflected a dominant way of thinking for many people of African and Asian descent. Okay. By the late 1970s, and with the rise of hip hop culture in Black and brown communities, the need to separate Islam and race, Blackness, shifted, and the terms Black and Muslim were fused together. So Muslim rappers like Tavasha Shannon are misunderstood, as she uses, and Buma Muhammad rap about what it means to be a proud Black Muslim. In his latest rap song, Black Hearts, Buma starts out saying, they tell me, brother, don't rap, you sound too Black. Fool, I am Black and Muslim, that's a fact. Let me see if I can give you a little taste of sort of what his, let me go back to. All right.
They tell me, brother, don't rap, you sound too Black. Fool, I am Black and Muslim, that's a fact. Melanin's like a sin to these men and they kin. Brown like cinnamon, killing them with these synonyms. Rah. Here we go again, blackmail, getting blackmail, cycle never ends. And don't you pretend that I am your friend, but behind closed doors, I'll try again, huh? You brothers really kill me, talking one ummah, but you don't even see me or greet me. Try and send you peace, you don't repeat. Please, when I speak, I'm a Muslim, believe me. And no, I'm not a convert. We was into hijrah when you was into idols. I don't need your permission to believe in this deed. We don't preach the superiority of a color only creed. And your deeds, if you read, you would see and agree. Unity is the key. We are one body, a sum of its parts. And I'd rather have black skin than the black heart. I'd rather have black skin, black skin. I'd rather have black skin than a black heart.
Okay, so you get a sense here that that there's a shift in the earlier period. We see. Let me actually. Am I ready to? Am I? Okay. Just and the slide. Okay. Back.
Yeah,
okay. Good. All right. So. From this rap, you can see that there's a shift in the ways in which African Americans begin to self-identify. On the one hand, it was about using Islam to sort of trump race, to get around race, right? To actually establish a new sense of the racial order, or actually to eliminate race altogether, right? Then by the hip hop era, a new generation of African American Muslims are now actually trying to conflate the two, fuse being Black and being Muslim, not wanting to sort of lose the kind of racial cred that they have within these communities, but also combine that with a kind of Islamic sensibility, right? And from here we go to the idea of how African American Muslims then sort of combine kind of again what it means to be a Black Muslim, but also with Black freedom struggles, also with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And this gets fused with people like Margaery. Aziza. Okay, sorry. This is all right. Now, by the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, with the murder of Trayvon Martin on February 26, 2012, right? Young Black Muslims and non-Black Muslim teenagers strove to fuse what it meant to be Muslim with current Black freedom struggles and the Black Lives Matter movement. So a major figure is Margaery Aziza of the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, or what is called Muslim ARC. Aziza states that she has helped to sustain conversations about racial justice in the Muslim community. We co-wrote, she says, letters with Muslims for Ferguson, and I've helped to facilitate roundtables on Black Lives Matter at ISNA, which is the Islamic Society of North America annual conference. For almost 2 years, she says, I've been curating the Black Lives Matter toolkit. I would tell now Black Muslims to first begin with some serious self-reflection on their internalized racism and the social barriers that may have kept them from connecting their struggle. So I want to end here with this image and this statement of a young Black Muslim woman who says, being Black and Muslim means you are the largest group of American Muslims, but you are the last to be asked to speak on Islam. So I end here by hoping that we can have a broader conversation. In other words, oftentimes at conferences on Islamophobia, we focus on sort of a top-down analysis, right? And we focus on the phobia, the fear. But we rarely talk about what Islam actually means to people, right? And how they have used it to sort of navigate and negotiate a new sense of freedom. Thank you.
Now we'll go to Professor Zarina Grewal, who is joining us via WebEx. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for just a quick Q&A discussion. If we have a means of getting Q&A or questions from online audiences, we'll try. If not, that's okay. We only have a few minutes, but I thought I would maybe pose a few questions, which we may or may not answer, but these were excellent presentations, and they triggered. We could have an entire day talking about these issues. So here are a few questions for Mustafa, a few for Zayn, and a few for Zarina. And again, we don't have to answer these questions, Zarina, we just conversation starters. So first is, I was very intrigued, Mustafa, with your statement that the Muslim American, right, this identity is one that was created after 9/11. And it's very provocative because it's one of those obvious points that you have to stop and go, yeah, that actually sounds right, but I never thought about that. And so that then triggers the question of what was the identity that people who now fall into the Muslim American, was it multiple identities, and what were they, and how and why, more importantly, did they end up converging into this kind of all-inclusive Muslim American identity that's just is taken for granted. So that's one. The other is I really like your naming and highlighting of this anxiety of disappearance, which I think is a good way to frame this rise of right-wing populism. I mean, it's one way to explain this rise of right-wing populism in the U.S. and in the West. And I remember in Charlottesville when they said, "You will not replace us," which I read as a very anti-Semitic statement because they said, "Jews, you will not replace us." But it was also about all of you non-WASPs, right? Non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which is taken for granted as the dominant American identity. And so that was a very clear expression of, we're not going to let you cause us to disappear, and that's kind of part of this whole narrative of white genocide. So that's a great way to frame it, anxiety of disappearance. But I wanted to interrogate that or go farther and say, how is that anxiety of disappearance in the West connected to the same, what I think is the same anxiety of disappearance that arguably has triggered what some will call political Islamism? In other words, when you listen to the rhetoric of, say, the Muslim Brotherhood, which I see as the generally nonviolent version of this rise of Islamic identity. And even when you go as far as the much more extreme violent version of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but many of them are very anti-Western and anti-secular in a way that is framed as, you will not quash Islam. You are coming in here, you're colonizing us, and you're westernizing and secularizing us, and you're going to make our Muslim identity and culture and way of life. So that was the first connection I thought, and I wonder if you think that is a proper analogy, or is this, no, we're talking about apples and oranges in terms of the anxiety of disappearance. Zayn, I love listening to you talk because I learned so much about something that is very within my area of interest, of this intersection of race and religion. And so when you were talking about Dizzy, the musician, saying that being Muslim meant you could be white, I kept thinking, how is that so? Because with Arabs, it's the complete opposite. Like especially the immigrant Arabs, as you know, the history of Syrian and Lebanese coming to the courts and saying, I'm white, and the fact that I'm Christian shows that I'm white. And those Muslim Arabs, those Muslim Middle Easterners, they're the non-whites, they're the Asians that can't qualify legally to naturalize as U.S. citizens. So I wanted to ask you how that, and it sounds like it's about the same era, if I'm not mistaken. I might be being anachronistic here or mismatching eras, but I just found that really intriguing that African Americans were using Muslim as a whitening force, while Arabs were using Muslim as a darkening, blackening force. So how that can happen kind of in the same country or context. And Zarina, so I'm very much looking forward to your project. It's very intriguing and created a lot of questions and things now that I want to do a lot more reading on this issue. When you were talking about, so this issue of ignorance vis-a-vis bigotry, it's a kind of a common theme, and when you think of especially in race studies, there is what we'll call the social psychology view of anti-racism, which is education. Stereotype and prejudice is an individual problem, and if we just educate people and we just teach them about this particular race or this group or this religion, then they will no longer hold this prejudice. And then that's kind of juxtaposed against the more structural, institutionalized view of no, this is much more of a meta problem. So when you were explaining or summarizing the polls of, which I hadn't realized this, that the polls of Americans not even knowing that the Quran was the holy book of Islam, knowing so little about Islam, but even to that extent, and yet having these very strong views and negative views about Islam. Does that cause you in any way to conclude that more education in world religions is part of the solution? Or does that, what is your analysis of this fact? Because it's very, it's a very kind of confounding fact. We knew that many Americans are ignorant about Islam, but I didn't realize it was to that extreme, where you don't even know, especially considering the very high-profile Quran burning incidents and the anti-Sharia campaigns, where the word Quran comes up a lot, and you would think that they would at least know that middle fact. So those are, again, we probably don't have time to answer all of those, but I thought I would just pose those questions and maybe give everybody an opportunity to respond either to my question or to someone else's comments or whatever you want to say. And then after that, we will we'll finish the panel and then move on to the keynote speech. So Mustafa, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, I think, just informationally, I think we can say that there were groups that were organized prior to 9/11, for example, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. But even there, let's look at the name, American Islamic Relations, as if those are almost two separate identities, right? And CARE's actions prior to 2001 were largely, I would argue, about American foreign policy. And they did deal to some degree with immigration issues in the United States, like secret evidence and things like that. Those were issues. But by and large, I would argue that most Muslims in the United States had multiple identities, not necessarily had a Muslim American identity, and that I think it's not a radical notion that once the state begins to define you, that then as a way of not being defined by the state, you want to claim that sense of definition and throw it back in the face of the state. And so,
It's a subversive act almost.
As an identity claiming act, yeah. I mean, I think it can follow a whole lot of different points on the political spectrum, but there's a line by Jean-Paul Sartre in his book Anti-Semite and Jew, where he says the Jew is the person who other people consider to be a Jew, right? And so that's where you're getting, I think, a lot of that sort of self-definition that's happening there. In terms of, and then the general culture, even like liberal responses to an increasingly Islamophobic state, suddenly have great concern for Muslim Americans, right? Because there's a kind of state repression going on around the idea of Muslim, and so then it enters into liberal discourse of the state, of the country as well. And so now you have, attempts, all kinds of attempts to have Muslim American participation. And then I think what happens also is the image, in the American sort of general American imagination of the Muslim changes. Because in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the image, as Zayn was telling us, if you said, name a famous American Muslim, people would say Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, right? After 2001, I think you get a different image. It's the immigrant potential terrorist image instead, yes. And so there's that shift as in one to track. I would disagree with the idea that the disappearance concept can be applied also to the Muslim Brotherhood, at least in the same way. I mean, this is, I'm talking about, is within right-wing circles is referred to as the Great Replacement Theory. I think Marwan might be talking about this later. In my talk, I was trying to say that there were two different poles of the reaction. So one is this sort of globalization, homogenization effect from globalization, but colonialism also plays a role here. And the discourse that you see coming out of a lot of the different Islamic movements, and the Islamic movements are also very different.
Yes,
and so
of course.
Even the Muslim Brotherhood is very different from one country to another, right? And so, I think one can see the rise of that way of thinking occurring at the same time that you see the defeat of the left and also of the Soviet Union. And so they're really deeply connected to a kind of colonial project and resistance to colonial projects and ways in which that resistance gets formulated and articulated. And so I think that's a very different level of political engagement than a kind of narrative of white disappearance. And of course, because it's fallacious. I mean, this idea of the replacement theory it's ridiculous, and it's deeply, deeply, deeply anti-Semitic. So the chant went from being "you will not replace us" to "Jews will not replace us," because that's the way of thinking, that somehow there's a Jewish conspiracy that's set on changing the demographics of white majority nations, and so it still finds a way of blaming Jews for their own immigrant anxieties. And in the United States, one of the things that's really important, I think, to underscore is that it's not just Islam, like that level of thinking, great replacement thinking or white supremacist thinking in the United States has an anti-Semitic component, obviously, has an anti-Muslim component, and has a deeply anti-immigrant component as well. And so the people in the United States that would subscribe to such ideas do not fear being replaced as much by Muslims as they do by Central Americans. Whereas in Europe, owing to different colonial histories and different geographies, it's about Muslims instead. So I think looking at those particularities is just the way that we really need to understand these phenomena and to begin to understand them.
Yep. Yeah. Well, thank you for your question. I think it's an interesting way of thinking about how racialization happens, especially for African Americans who are trying to navigate and negotiate religion and race. But I guess I see it a bit differently, right? So I kind of see it because I don't think it's a whitening of the African American self. I think it's more of a rewriting the narrative for oppressed peoples, because African American Muslims in Black and brown communities also have a different status, right? And it's not about whitening, right? It's about the ways in which the new narrative connects them to a different place, right? Asia, Africa, and all that. And so you get Latinos and others who actually might embrace Islam because they want to have a different history, right? A kind of connectedness to a different history, right? Now, when it comes to white Americans and trying to negotiate segregated lunch counters and the like, it's a way of sort of seeing these subjects as not a part of the American subject, right? So Black Muslims then are not Negroes, thus they're not under the American system of right subjugation.
Being a foreigner and an immigrant is a higher status than being Black American.
Well, in that
context,
higher but different, right? In that context, right? So still, I don't see it as a whitening, right, but I do see it as kind of an othering, right? So now you become something other than Negro, other than Black, right? And it's a reading of the body, right? A kind of sartorial kind of reading, right? Because they have either the fez on or they have some kind of clothing that actually sort of designates them as something different than Negro or different than Black, right? But again, so for me, it cuts both ways. African Americans in white spaces get read differently. African American Muslims in, say, Black and brown spaces are sort of celebrated in a way that actually allows others to actually construct new narratives about themselves.
Yeah, thank you. That's really that makes a lot of sense. Serena?
Yep. Yeah. So thanks for the question. And I also just want to say something back to Mustafa's comment first, if I may. I think that, one of the things that I was trying to get at was that I think the way the literature splits is that there are those studies that are looking at things from the perspective, basically what Zayn did, which is what is the perspective of actual American Muslims or Muslim communities themselves and their own world making and how they understand themselves. So there, of course, before September 11th, there were many, CARE is one of many, many organizations. There were many organizations that did use the moniker of American Muslim or Muslim American. But I think Mustafa's point that it becomes a category in the dominant kind of American discourse after September 11th, or maybe thereabouts. We can talk about the periodization of it. But I think that those two levels at which you have internal Muslim discourses and discourses from the outside, dominant discourses about Muslims and how they touch each other or don't touch each other, I think is actually a major issue for our field. And how do we study Muslims, but also think about anti-Muslim racism, Islamophobia, or Islamophilia, whatever you want to call it. I think this is actually one of our big challenges. I mean, I myself am grappling with it. So I'm sort of sharing, stuff that's not quite so polished, precisely because I am grappling with what these different words mean. I think what Mustafa brought up about victim identification, that, the danger of victim identification. It's really interesting. A book I just highly recommend, Melanie McAllister's The Kingdom of God Has No Borders, which is basically I think it's very similar to my book about American Muslims. It's about like the ummah concept among American evangelicals. Now, what's really interesting is that in that case, American evangelicals' identification with their ummah is politically empowering. In the case of American Muslims, it's the exact opposite. It's precisely that their identification with the ummah is with a population. In other words, in both cases, they're victims. But for Muslims, it is our ummah is suffering, but there's no political purchase from that. Whereas for evangelicals, of course, there is. That's just one thing I wanted to bring up. And then my other kind of point is that, to me, as I think about, one of the ways that I've thought about it is that Islamophobia captures the figure of the white Muslim in a particular way, that people worry that a different formulation like anti-Muslim racism doesn't. And my own project, which is trying to think about race and racism and the racialization of Islam beyond, I mean, including bodies, but also beyond bodies, to move to like this, a text that can stand in for bodies. That's just something that I'm just interested in what my colleagues if they have thoughts about that. To your particular question about, you know, education, I absolutely, the whole purpose of that public syllabus, Islamophobia is anti-Muslim racism, is to, you know, just get us away from this idea that, you know, Wikipedia entries in the 5 pillars of Islam are going to solve the problem. They're absolutely not. You know, the more data we kind of share, I mean, all these like mosque open houses that happened after 9/11, it was like, if only our neighbors knew us. That's not how racism works. And it's a fundamental misunderstanding of American history, racism. I mean, it's precisely going to what Mustafa's beautiful final sentence was, which is that the way you fight Islamophobia is by, you know, is through liberation of everybody. It's not about, you know, getting people to understand what text we use, what's the Quran called, you know, how to spell Muhammad, what are the 5 pillars. You know, none of this is going to do anything. And in fact, part of what my book is about is how among the bigots, the people who are part of that anti-Muslim industry, they actually have incredibly large amounts of technical knowledge. I mean, Spencer knows a thing or two about Muslims, you know, that's what I'm discovering. And in fact, I mean, I have a joke, I get these Quranic verses tweeted at me, the quote unquote problematic verses, all the time. There are these like Islamophobic hufaz who basically have memorized whatever 10 verses they think are going to make me leave Islam. And they, you know, tweet them at me. That's a kind of way of sort of being trolled online. So, I mean, they are very fixated on the knowledge, sort of data or info about Islam, and they, you know, instrumentalize it for their own purposes. So, yeah.
Well, I wish we could talk about this all day. So first I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank everyone who's online. And we are going to move into the second phase and the highlight of our day with our keynote speaker. And I guess we take just a little break before, and then we'll do our introduction for those who are online. So we'll just be in transition. But first, those of you who are here and those online, please join me in thanking our esteemed and brilliant panelists.
Thank you.